and for every joy with the joy of thy love and of thy good pleasure, and for all things pertaining unto me, which bear no relationship unto thee. O thou art the Lord of lords, he who provided the means and unlocketh the doors. Amen.
Allah, dear friends, it's my pleasure to share this session with two great speakers this morning. We start with Dr. Zack Heern. Dr. Heern has a PhD in Middle Eastern and Middle Eastern Studies and World History. He's a professor of history, and his first book had to do with the Shi'i reformism in Iraq and Iran. So you already know that with that title, you know that he's interested in the study of Shi'i ulama. And what he's going to do today, he's going to talk about references in Bahá'u'llah's writings to the ulama, particularly the Shi'i ulama. So Dr. Heern will talk for 25 minutes, then we'll have questions and answers. Please.
Thank you so much. I first want to thank the Foreign True Center for inviting us all here and for organizing this. It's been such a wonderful gathering, and of course for Greenacre for hosting us, and for all of you for attending. This is really wonderful. It's a rare pleasure to be able to give a talk that's related to Islam for Baha'is, and to start with a Baha'i prayer. Usually I'm used to, mujtahids and mullahs in the front row and being very intimidated. So this is much more friendly audience and for people to be questioning what I'm doing. So of course, because of my academic background in Islamic studies, I've been interested in particularly Shia clerics, as was mentioned. And I've been really fascinated about this question about what the relationship between the Baha'i faith and Islam is. I think if you look at Baha'u'llah's writings, it would be very difficult to find anything but praise for Muhammad and the Quran. But when it comes to clerics, it's a different story. So there's not a lot of praise here. A lot of this has to do with Baha'u'llah's own biography and his background, and of course his writings follow that trajectory. Before I go any further, I'd like to dedicate this talk to the Baha'is in Iran who are being persecuted by these Muslim clerics. So where do we generally find clerics in Baha'u'llah's writings? Here is a quick snapshot. The short story is that we find it throughout Baha'u'llah's writings, from quite early in the hidden words. We might read the hidden words and think, I never saw the word mullah or cleric or anything in there. But in the Epistle of the Son of Wolf, Baha'u'llah mentions about 4 hidden words that specifically refer to clergy. And the Kitab-i-Iqan are like long sections that deal with this issue, and we'll get into some of these references. And then of course, when Baha'u'llah was in Kurdistan, he met these Sufi sheikhs, and either because of a question that they raised, he revealed a tablet based on what they had wanted. Also, they're the addressees of the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys. These are both Sufi sheikhs. So we don't find many references in those tablets to clerics. However, there's the sort of clerical Sufi background. It could certainly be read into The other thing that the Guardian tells us very clearly, that Bahá'u'llah's proclamation was addressed to religious leaders and political leaders. Those are the sort of two major categories that his proclamation was addressed to in Adrianople. And then anytime that Baha'u'llah discusses the persecution of Babis or Baha'is or injustices, his own suffering, almost always Muslim clerics are involved, and they're the cause of that. So we find it there as well. Towards the end of Baha'u'llah's life, we get the Lahi Burhan and the Epistle of Son of the Wolf. They're both addressed to Muslim clerics who were responsible for the death of the king and beloved of martyrs, who have been mentioned several times throughout this weekend. And those are probably the most scathing. Baha'u'llah presented his life as very direct and very clear about these things. One thing I found fascinating is that in some answer questions, there's a short biography that Abdu'l-Baha wrote about Baha'u'llah. I thought it was very fascinating that Baha'u'llah's sort of Muslim background is very clearly stated here. The very first sentence is the first bullet point here. It says, the Baha'u'llah appeared at a time when Persia was plunged into the darkest ignorance and consumed by the blindest fanaticism. That fanaticism is sort of caused by the Shia clerics. And he makes a point to say that Baha'u'llah was not from a religious family, right? He didn't have to say that, but he wanted to make it very clear. He also wanted to make it very clear that Baha'u'llah never studied in their schools. He didn't associate with them. He didn't know them. He didn't probably want to know them. Abdu'l-Baha makes this very clear that he was not. And of course, that's one of the criticisms that Muslim clerics have about Baha'u'llah. That you're not one of us. How could you possibly be making these claims when you're not even a religious figure yourself? Abdu'l-Baha says that the most vehement opposition that Babis and Baha'is faced were from the divines. Usually the term in English that's translated from ulama is divine, at least in Baha'u'llah's writings. In Shoghi Effendi's writings, he uses some other terms like ecclesiastics or religious leaders or clergy, but usually in Baha'u'llah's writings, we see the word divine. So, and he lists out all of these things. They're the result, their decrees, their fatwas were the result of that was massacre, pillage, persecution, annihilation of Muhammad and his followers. On the other hand, Abdu'l-Baha says that, and we see this in Baha'u'llah's writings as well, that everywhere he went, everywhere Baha'u'llah went, the learned, when they did seek his presence, they received a complete and convincing answer to every question. And we'll get into that. One of the themes that we see in Baha'u'llah's writings is that he wanted to meet with religious leaders and he wanted to confront them and have a dialogue with them. So speaking of those things, this is the sort of, for the rest of the talk, these are the things that I will focus on. These are some of the prominent themes. I'm sure you could think of others, but these are the prominent themes I've chosen to talk about in terms of what we see from Baha'u'llah's writings. So the killing of the Bab and Babis, the fact that knowledge is now dependent on the recognition of Baha'u'llah, which basically makes the ulama obsolete, because even the word ulama comes from ilm, knowledge. So if they're responsible for knowledge and all knowledge goes through Baha'u'llah, then they're basically obsolete. Baha'u'llah's proclamation, like I just said, the failure of religious leaders to recognize Baha'u'llah. And one thing there are several references where Baha'u'llah actually says that not only are they responsible for the persecution of Baha'is and Babis, but the ulama are also responsible for the downfall of Islam itself and the decay of Islam. We'll get into that a little bit too, and partially because they misinterpreted the Quran and the Hadith. So their entire job, everything they were supposed to do, they're failing at, and we can talk about why. Once we get into that. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of highlighted text Get ready for it. Okay, so the responsibility for killing the Bab and Babis, he basically puts this on the Shia sect. He says for 1,200 years, they've always called out the Bahá'í. The whole religion is based on the Bahá'í and the return of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. And they've, for 1,200 years, they focused their attention on the Bahá'í. And then when he came in the Bab, they sentenced him to death. And Baha'u'lláh says that he heard that from the lips of one of the mujtahids who said, look, if the 12th Imam comes back, we will definitely kill him. So they had been planning this for a while. In the Table of the Kings, Baha'u'lláh says that as well, that specifically the divines of Persia unjustly slew the Bab. The divines pronounced sentence against him, and they put all of these holy souls, the followers of the Bab, to death. Baha'u'lláh lays that responsibility squarely at the feet of the ulama, and I think even more so than the Qatar government or the military or anywhere else. The primary responsibility has to do with specifically Shia clerics. So this issue of knowledge and power being dependent on recognition of Baha'u'lláh, if Baha'u'lláh is the supreme manifestation for this day, then all knowledge will go through him. So there are several references in the Kitab-i-Iqan where Baha'u'lláh says, if the religious leaders, this is a very big if the religious leaders be in the likeness of the Son of Truth, in the likeness of Baha'u'lláh, then they will become exalted luminaries. And he actually lists some of those. And you could probably think of that. Just look in the Dawn Breakers and look for the word Mullah. Mullah Hussein, Mullah Ali Bastami, even some of the 18 letters of the living. They were there. There were quite a few religious figures who followed the Bab. So they achieved this. However, if they don't, they will be recognized as the focal centers of Polish fire. Unfortunately, that was the majority of them, right? That was the majority of these. So specifically related to knowledge, the so-called learning of the religious establishment compared with the knowledge of Baha'u'lláh is utter falsehood, right? It's blatant error. And in the Lahi Burhan, Baha'u'lláh specifically says, he defines the learned intellectuals as those who have acknowledged his revelation. And he's very clear about this, acknowledge my revelation, not the, we don't get any sort of flower through. This is his revelation, not necessarily the Bab's, his. And then he also defines the divines, the religious figures, as those who outwardly attire themselves with knowledge, but inwardly are deprived. So they sort of like the analogy I've often heard Persians use is like either a camel or probably even more a donkey with a library on its back. This is the idea, right? And Baha'u'lláh says that none of their sciences, their arts, their treasures, their businesses, nothing can profit them in this day, except for through his name. And he tells them to cast them behind their backs. All of your Islamic law, all of your Islamic sciences, you could throw them away. It's all garbage, right? Which, for the religious establishment, I once was on a panel discussing something similar, and one of the Islamic studies professors said, that is pretty naughty of Baha'u'lláh. You can kind of get like why they were upset. This, it hurt their feelings. And then in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, we have this reference where Baha'u'lláh says, weigh not the book of God by the such standards and sciences are current amongst you. So you can't use your own traditions, your own intellectual understanding. The book itself, the Kitab-i-Aqdas itself is the standard. right? And that specifically addressed the leaders of religion, right? That they're the ones that have that issue. So throughout Baha'u'llah's life, he did, even from a very early age, as soon as he became a follower of the Bab, he started meeting with and challenging religious figures, and he wanted to do that throughout his entire life. And he basically, in the Kitab al-Aqdas itself, he says, so ye leaders of religion in Persia, who is the man that can rival me? He wanted to battle intellectually, right? Spiritually. Can any one of you race with the divine youth? It's a spiritual foot race. He's challenged them to, right? This is my limited understanding. That's the way I think. And he repeatedly requested, including to the tablet to Nasruddin Shah, he says that please gather all of the religious leaders, and they can all be on the same team. I will be on my own team, and then we will face each other and we'll decide who's right. And he requested that the Shah be there. You should be the president. Of course, it's never happened. Had it happened, that would have been an interesting scene. And even there were several times where they thought, we'll challenge him, he'll back down, and he didn't back down. Right? Even remember in Baghdad where he's, they, from Najaf and Karbala, they saw this guy, and they were like, yeah, he's true, he's really knowledgeable. And they said, okay, we want to challenge you to produce a miracle. And they thought he was never going to do that. And he said, okay, you choose the miracle, but if I do it, then you have to believe. But they're like, okay, never mind. We're not going to do that. And he challenged them, produce by what proof, right? Even in the Taliban, by what proof? What proof are you? What hadith? What Quranic verse? What science are you denying that I'm the truth? Whatever topic you want to discuss, we can talk about it. Anything. But ultimately, for the most part, they failed to seek his presence. And he says in the Surah Muluk that religious leaders, learned people, failed to seek his presence. As I said already, and God passes by, this historical proclamation in Adrianople was directed to the kings and the ecclesiastical leaders, not just Muslims, but also Christians as well. He tells Christians to stop ringing their bell. He tells monks to go out and do something useful with their life instead of sitting in the monastery and praying all day. Baha'u'lláh himself says, since the early days, he has come face to face with the divines and summoned them to the straight path. So throughout his entire life, and he suffered, of course, as a result. Most of Baha'u'llah's sufferings, if not all of it, came from this. So ultimately, they failed to recognize Baha'u'llah. Most of the doctors of divines, Baha'u'llah says, turned away from me. This is a sort of really emotional in the Ishraqat where Baha'u'llah is speaking to God, right? They've turned away from me. It's very emotional. He basically tells the divines in the Kitab al-Aqdas, we found you behind the veils. And this is another issue that we'll talk about next. They also put up a veil for others, right? That's another thing. It's one, if as an individual you're going to cut yourself off, but you're going to cut other people off from the truth, that's even a bigger problem. And Baha'u'llah repeatedly says in the Epistle of Son of the Wolf that not a single one of the leaders of the Shia sect acknowledged him. None of them were cognizant of this revelation. So preventing other people. So this is where some of those hidden words come in. The first one you probably recognize that he refers to religious leaders as wolves intent upon my flock, who leadeth the wayfarers of my city astray. So this is way back in Baghdad. Baha'u'llah's already called them And in the Kitab-i-Agan, the Shoghi Effendi said this is one of the major themes of the Kitab-i-Agan, that it's not just the Shias. Religious leaders of every age have done this. And he goes through and lists, he says, here's what happens during the time of Muhammad, here's what happened to Jesus, here's what happened to Moses. The Shia clerics are just doing what clerics do. Which I think is one of the, if we sort of reflect on that, I think that's one of the reasons that as the Baha'i faith we have this unique situation where we don't have clergy, right? Baha'u'lláh sort of reflects what good have they actually done in the past. If they're constantly preventing people from the truth, then maybe there's a problem. And so in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, he tells the religious leaders, make not of yourselves a veil between me and my creatures. So it's one thing to veil yourself and cover your eyes, but don't put that veil in front of the eyes of others. And so they've constantly debarred men from this transcendent station. Okay, I want to be quiet for a second, and I would like you to read this and think about what, because I have my own interpretation of what these references mean, but I would love to hear from you. So we're going to turn it. So if you can everybody read that, or would you like me to read that?
You can read it.
You can read it. Okay, go ahead and read it, think about it, maybe even talk to someone next to you, and then tell me what you think. It's a lot of text, sorry.
I have an answer.
Okay, 5 minutes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, basically, the divines have put their prophet ahead of God. That's how I see it. They put Muhammad ahead of God. You know, we're worshiping Muhammad, we're following Muhammad, we're interpreting what he wants us to do. But in doing that, they have put the prophet ahead of their belief and trust and reliance on God.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
It's all about power.
Uh-huh.
And this is, I've heard it from younger people in Iran, and many clerks have told Bahá'ís that if Bahá'u'lláh hadn't put us out of the job, all of us would have followed him.
Right.
And I'll challenge you, do you think if someone came here and declared that they are Jesus, and they've come back and returned of Christ,
Yeah.
how many of the churches do you think would rise up and support? It's all about control and power.
Control power. Yeah, interesting. Excellent. Okay. In the interest of the time, I'll keep going. But what I see here in these references is that Baha'u'lláh basically has to exercise wisdom. Because in the Four Valleys, he said, I would conceal more, I would reveal more to you. But whoever does this will be hanged from the gallows. Who's going to hang him from the gallows? The Mushtahids, right? But he says still though, even though if a pure, what does he say? A true seeker be found, I would divulge his name. So if there are hearing ears, then I will still divulge it. And so there are all these other references that says, so imagine we would have even gotten more of the divine truth, I think, had it not been for this threat, right? If people have been more receptive, right? Even in our own teaching, if someone's more receptive, we give them more, right? If they're not, we give them a little bit less, right? So I think about what knowledge could we have had if it hadn't been for these speakers. Okay, quickly, I'll go through the last because we're running out of time. The ulama caused the downfall of Islam. Baha'u'lláh specifically says twice, he quotes this in the Law of Bahrain and in the Epistle of the Son of the Wolf, because of you, O concourse of divines, the banner of Islam was hauled down and its mighty throne subverted. He repeatedly says that Muhammad sheds tears at the fact of what you're doing, specifically after the death of martyrdom of the king of blood of the martyrs that caused Muhammad, and the Holy Muslim family to lead. The standard of Islam has been reversed and its mighty throne has fallen. You have sapped the strength of Islam. And Abdul Baha verifies this. He says that the foundation of religion of Muhammad is no more. Foundations are totally gone, but the outward remains are in the hands of the imams. So it's this shell. As my wife's grandmother used to say, who was her family were clerics at home. She said it's like the chicken with a head cut. Right? This is the religion. It's like kind of running around aimless as noticed. And part of the reason for all of this is a misinterpretations of the Quran and Hadith. Partially a literal reading of the Quran. They firmly held to the letter of the Word of God. They've idly contended that former laws cannot be altered. And he says that Jews did the same thing, right? Their law is supposed to be forever. So lots of different misconceptions and misunderstandings. As someone mentioned the other day, there's a hadith for everything, right? No matter what your argument is, you just pull a hadith, and sometimes they disagree with each other. And then there's the interpretation of those hadiths. So I think if we're sort of to boil this down, a major difference between what the clerics are doing and what Bahá'u'lláh is doing is that the fundamental principle of Bahá'í faith is unity, and this is what Bahá'u'lláh was trying to do, and they have been the cause of disunity. So he even complains, he said, when I was in Iran, I heard the cry of the pulpits because they're shouting blasphemous things from me, right? You heard them saying that. Okay, last thing that I want to say is that Bahá'u'lláh says that he sees power from the clerics specifically, right? And Shoghi Effendi charts the sort of experience of each of these individuals, but also the whole thing, the caliphate and the Ottoman Empire falling, the Shia establishment being secularized in Iran. But ultimately, Baha'u'lláh says that you shall not henceforth behold yourselves possessed of any power. We have seized it from you. I think that also that means to us as Baha'is, we don't have clergy. Right? I think that wasn't exactly clear to a lot of people. Even up to the time the House of Justice was elected, people were still kind of trying to become like the next Baha'i mullah. Baha'u'lláh constantly tells them to fear God. I'll leave you with my favorite reference that I found. This is in Promised Day of the Conqueror's Come. Baha'u'lláh says that a paring from the nail of one of the believing handmaidens is more esteemed in this day than the divine solution. So if you're ever feeling bad about yourself, know that your fingernail, I told my daughter, I was like, your fingernail is worth more than super wealthy, super powerful figures. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.